Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. And this year is dedicated, as always, praying for the victory of our Chayolim, the lasting unity of the people of Israel, and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, for the safe return of all of the hostages. As you know, they are being released. If you see the most recent hostages, you can get a true picture of what actually was going on. Rahman al-Islam. The suffering is just unbelievable. Although, Baruch Hashem, they are back. My speculation is that Hamas stopped the deal because they want to fatten up the rest, so it shouldn't be a repetition of the very bad visual. But the problem is this is not just a visual, this is a metzius of things that were actually done. So, we still need tefillos, we still need HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we still need siyata d'shmaya, as we always do. And B'ezras Hashem, all of those who are still in captivity should come back safely in good health, and those who were released also should be emotionally and physically restored in every way. In addition, Aliyat Neshamot, Yitzchak Hirsh ben Eliezer, and again we appreciate the Hachzakas Torah. We now come, of course, Parshas Yitro. This is a biggie. This is Matan Torah. This is really the whole reason for the Exodus in the first place. I remember in the 1970s when there was a lot of agitation to free Soviet Jews. Every shul, conservative, Reform, Orthodox, had a sign quoting the verse, "Let my people go." The truth is, that's not a totally accurate translation. The Hebrew is shalach, send forth my people. But besides that, they left out the next word, let my people go, or send forth my people, vayavduni, so they will serve me. Meaning, freedom was not an end in and of itself. A person can never make the argument, the purpose of life is to be free, because that just begs the question, free to do what? Free to be what? Freedom is a beautiful thing, because it creates the conditions under which you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. But freedom does not give content to that life. Erich Fromm, who happened to be Jewish, but he was a disciple of Sigmund Freud, who also happened to be Jewish, but once made the point that society makes a very big mistake when we define freedom as freedom from something. Freedom has to be towards something. It has to be towards a goal. And for us, it's Kabbalah Satorah. That's the goal. In fact, that's why the whole idea of Sphira, if you think about the idea of counting the Omer. Counting the Omer is a connector. It is a linkage between the holiday of freedom, which is Pesach, and the holiday of Shavuos, which is Torah. And in effect, the Ramban actually writes that the period of counting of the Omer, we'll talk more about it when we get into that period, is actually a one long Chol HaMoed, meaning Pesach and Shavuos are really one holiday. And there's a long Chol HaMoed. So if you tell your boss you don't work during Chol HaMoed and you don't show up from Pesach to Shavuos, you have some excuse, although I absolutely cannot guarantee your job will be waiting for you after that type of absence. But the idea that it's one holiday is because Pesach without Shavuos has no meaning, has no purpose. Cheres from Avdos means nothing unless it results in a dedication of your freedom for a higher purpose. Now this actually explains an Ashkenazi custom. It's a custom, it's not a chiyuv, it's not an obligation by any means, of the idea that the first bit of food that we have after the matzah and the maror at the Seder is we have the hard-boiled egg. Hard-boiled egg. Now some people treat that like it's one of the 613 mitzvahs. They can skip the matzah, but they have to have the hard-boiled egg. But the hard-boiled egg is a minhag Ashkenazi, and there are different reasons that are given for it. One reason is that an egg is the food that you give a mourner, right? After a funeral, the very first food that's eaten, hard-boiled egg. And the reason for that is eggs are oval in shape, so actually chickpeas would be good as well. But the idea is that life is like a cycle. There are bad times, but it turns. Gal gal hachoser, the turning wheel of life, that don't be miyayish. So in a sense, Leil Seder, which of course is largely a happy day, there's a certain element of mourning Leil Seder because we don't have the Korban Pesach. So we want to have the comfort of the egg, to be menachem avel, comfort the mourner. But in a deeper way, it's been pointed out that under the Jewish calendar, the first night of Pesach is always the same night of the week as Tisha B'Av, meaning the first day of Pesach is the same day of the week as Tisha B'Av. Now, and therefore, we kind of think about Tisha B'Av, Leil Seder. But why would we want to bring in Tisha B'Av, Leil Seder? So here is my speculation. I didn't see a particular source for this. The first night of Pesach is the only night which you're not connecting freedom to Torah, because you don't start counting the Omer till the second night. So the first night represents freedom that is not yet circumscribed by submission to God. And maybe the lesson of the calendar is a freedom that is not combined with Kabbalat O Malchus Shamayim, acceptance of the yoke of heaven, will ultimately lead to a Tisha B'Av. Freedom alone will be destructive. Anarchy, immorality, hedonism. And therefore, in a sense, having the egg, Leil Seder, is the substitute for not counting the Omer, Leil Seder. We'll discuss later why don't we start counting the Omer the first night of Pesach. We'll talk about that maybe some other time. But the point basically is that freedom, when it's not linked to Torah, is going to be destructive. Now, there's another explanation for the egg that leads to exactly the same conclusion, but by a different route. This is from the Ishbitzer. The Ishbitzer, very beloved Rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach kind of brought him to the popular front. He goes back to the 19th century. The Ishbitzer was a very profound, revolutionary thinker in many, many, many ways. Ishbitzer is one of those thinkers who says all sorts of provocative things that get censored or muted or whatever it is. He was actually the Rebbe of Reb Tzadok of Lublin, who is actually more known in the yeshiva world. But the Ishbitzer tended to teach in short, episodic thoughts. Rav Tzadok tended to be much more lengthy in terms of developing the Ishbitzer's thoughts. But the Ishbitzer was indeed his Rebbe in Chasidus. And the Ishbitzer says the following: if you look at an egg is laid by a chicken, right? Chicken egg. So you see that a chicken is born in two stages. There is the laying of the egg, and then there is the hatching of the egg, right? The chicken lays an egg, and then whatever days later, the chick emerges from the egg. Unlike mammals, which are born alive, right? In chickens, or birds generally, have a double stage. The egg, and then the hatching of the egg. So he says, Klal Yisrael is exactly that way. As a nation, we experience a double birth. Yetziat Mitzrayim is like the laying of the egg. But we're not really born as a nation till we get the Torah. And therefore the egg itself, again, it's ultimately the same idea, that we shouldn't think our completion as a nation is Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have to recognize that Matan Torah is our ultimate completion. And in fact, you can actually see this from the 4 cups of wine. I mean, 2 weeks ago, we learned the source, as you know anyway, for the mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, drinking 4 cups of wine, and that's because in Parshat Va'era, there are 4 lishonot of redemption. V'hotzeisi, I take you out. V'hitzalti, I will save you. V'ga'alti, I will redeem you. V'lokachti, I will take you unto me for a nation. And because of these 4 lishonos of Geula, the sages enacted that we commemorate it by 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Right? This is a well-known idea that the Takana d'Rabbanan, it is d'Rabbanan, I want to emphasize, the Takana d'Rabbanan of Dalid Kosos at the Seder is connected to 4 Lashonos of Geula. And if you want to hear a shir of the 4 Lashonos, you can go back 2 weeks ago and hear a shir. But I want to make a very simple point at this point. The 4th Lashon of Geula, I take you unto me for a nation, is actually referring to the revelation at Sinai. It is not referring to the exodus from Egypt. So it turns out that it's implicit, actually explicit, that Matan Torah is part and parcel of the exodus from Egypt, because in point of fact, the 4th Lashon of Geula is because of Matan Torah. You see? So you see very clearly that Matan Torah is not frosting on the cake. It's not something that's added to the experience of freedom, but it is the very reason why that freedom exists. Now we know that there's a mitzvah every single day to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim, every single day. In fact, day and night. That's why in the 3rd paragraph of Shema, when we say the verse, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, right? Hashem says, I am the Lord your God, Asher Hotzeisi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of Egypt to be your God. So if you look in the Art Scroll Siddur, you will actually see one should have intention when reciting this verse to fulfill the mitzvah, the oraisa, of recounting the Exodus. In fact, these are 2 different mitzvahs. Leil Pesach, which is an annual event, there's a mitzvah called Sipor, elaboration, a long story, the Haggadah. During the year, there's a different mitzvah that's called Zechira, orally remembering it in brief. Right? Sipor is the long story. Zechira is the short story. But there's a daily mitzvah connected to the Exodus. Now, the Ramban writes in the Sefer HaMitzvos. Again, Sefer HaMitzvos is, of course, a book written by Rambam, Maimonides. But Ramban wrote a number of criticisms and disagreements and comments on the Sefer HaMitzvos. For example, he argues that the Rambam should have included certain commandments and he didn't. Among them, which is not our topic, is the famous Shita of the Ramban that living in Eretz Yisrael is a positive mitzvah d'oraisa, which the Rambam Maimonides does not count, and Ramban says should be counted. So among the, I'm sorry.
But he said Rambam. Sorry,
yeah.
I'm confusing with Rashi. Sorry.
Okay, so among the omissions that the Ramban criticizes the Rambam for omitting is actually a mitzvah that the Ramban says that every person is obligated, just as they are obligated to remember the Exodus every day, they are obligated to remember the revelation at Mount Sinai every day.
No, actually it was Rambam because it's implicit in the... He said that there's only 3 reasons why you should be outside of Israel. Mm-hmm. And it was Rambam that said that, which was to marry, to make the Messiah, or to teach Torah.
No, that's very, very true. The problem is more of a technical problem, and that is in the listing of the 613 mitzvot, Rambam does not have a mitzvah called living in the land of Israel. So you're dealing with the problem of listing, and the Ramban says that should be added to the list. Now, I don't want to get into the methodology here, but you understand there's a certain problem here because of the number 613, meaning if you're committed to the idea that you got to come up with 613 commandments, 248 positive and 365 negative, that actually means every time you add a mitzvah, you got to figure out a way to it has to balance out, right? So all right, just take it on faith that the Rishonim deal with this problem, meaning every time there's an addition, there's a subtraction, or you include it in something else. The Ramban figured all of this out. So whenever he adds, he also subtracts. Usually by subtraction, I don't mean eliminate it, but kind of subsume it under something else and the like. And that's a whole chachma that the Rishonim have to go into. Although Ramban does make a bit of a subversive suggestion that who says we got to go with 613? I mean, this is actually an isolated opinion of a rabbi in the Gemara, that there's a total of 613 commandments. But it's not an article of faith. I mean, we believe everything in the Torah is from God, but that it has to add up to 613, the Ramban actually suggests, Maybe not. What would be wrong if we would say there are, 700 mitzvahs in the Torah? The Ramban actually flirts with that suggestion. He then says, yeah, but it's pretty clear. Chazal go with the 613, so we ought to accept it. But he does say it's not an article of faith. Okay, that's an very interesting point. So we don't have to shoehorn things, meaning if we find extra mitzvahs, we don't necessarily have to diminish it because we're not wedded. Okay, but be it as it may, the Ramban does count as a mitzvah to remember the experience of being at Mount Sinai and hearing God give the commandments. Now, what exactly we heard at Mount Sinai is itself a very, very interesting debate. The standard rabbinic explanation at Mount Sinai is we only heard the first two commandments. We heard God's voice, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Mitzrayim. And the second one is, thou shalt not have any other gods beside me. And then we were frightened, we were scared, and we begged Moshe Rabbeinu to be the intermediary for the rest. And therefore we did not hear the 10 commandments according to the Gemara. We only heard 2 commandments. And the other 8 were communicated by Moshe, as well as the rest of the Torah. Right, all the 613 we heard from Moshe. And the Gemara in Makos derives this from a very interesting gematria. And the interesting gematria is that the pasuk says in Zos HaBracha, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us or commanded us the Torah. The gematria of Torah, right? The Tuf is 400, and the Vav is 6, and the Reish is 200, 606, and the 5 is 611. We got 611 from Moshe, but 2 of them we got from God. Of course, that does raise an interesting question. And again, I'm going off on all sorts of side paths, which I'm not going to develop, but just for you to think about. And that is, well, wait a second here. 2 commandments we heard from God. Then we got scared. So the rest of the 10 commandments, as well as the rest of the Torah over time, we heard from Moshe. And that's why Moshe gave us 611. And God gave us 2. But what are the 2 that God gave us? I am the Lord your God who took you out of Mitzrayim. You shall not have any other gods. But wait a second. What commandment is that first one? Meaning, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Mitzrayim. Is that a mitzvah? That's a statement, right? So what mitzvah is in the idea that I am the Lord your God? So the truth is, Maimonides, the Rambam actually counts Anochi Hashem Elokecha as a positive mitzvah. It is the mitzvah to believe in God. The mitzvah of emunah. Ramban, once again, has a logical problem with that. How can you be commanded to believe in God? I mean, if I don't believe in God, what is the source of the authority that's going to make me believe in God? It's like telling an atheist, a person says, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. And I say, you can't be an atheist. You're not allowed to be an atheist. And he says, why not? He says, because God says you got to believe in him. But I don't believe in God. So Ramban actually argues it's impossible for there to be a mitzvah of emunah. Once you have emunah, then everything God says you have to listen to. So emunah, Anochi, is a foundational principle that actually predates, so to speak, specific commandments. That's a very strong argument. What would the Rambam say to that? In other words, the Rambam does count Anochi as a mitzvah of emunah. What do you mean a mitzvah of emunah? So many understand that the Rambam is saying the following. The mitzvah of emunah cannot be directed to a non-believer because he doesn't accept that mitzvah. It's directed to a believer. And it's basically saying, you who believe in God because you were raised that way, because you were taught that way, you are obligated to undergo a search where you intellectually comprehend the necessity for the existence of God and don't simply believe in God as a matter of tradition or blind faith. In other words, Maimonides, I'll say Maimonides because Rambam and Ramban sometimes get mixed up, they're hard to hear, so forgive me using the English or the Latin term. Maimonides actually says, philosophically demonstrating the existence of God is the mitzvah of emunah. Don't do it on blind faith or tradition. Engage in philosophical speculation. I just want to point out that the very thing that Maimonides considers to be a mitzvah, there are other authorities who consider it to be almost an aveira. And they highly discourage philosophical exploration of the existence of God for a very simple reason. You never know where you're going to come out. Now, Maimonides was so confident that the truth will emerge that, yeah, explore it philosophically, because for sure you'll come to the right conclusion. And I guess we would believe that too. Truth is truth. But the reality of human experience is that we bring biases, we bring agendas, and therefore there is, pragmatically at least, a lot to be said for not opening up Pandora's boxes. So an example would be, if you take a book like The Guide to the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, written by the Rambam, the same Rambam who wrote the Mishnah Torah. So I remember just a few weeks ago, a guy from the outside walked into the Or Sameach Beis Medrash, and he asked me where the Rambam's Svarim are in the Beis Medrash. So I showed him, this is the shelf that has all the Rambam's Svarim. So he's looking, he says, I don't see the Moreh Nevuchim, I don't see the Guide to the Perplexed there. Well, the answer is, in the Yeshiva Beis Medrash, you're not going to see the Guide to the Perplexed. It's not just Or Sameach, any Yeshiva Beis Medrash. They'll have it somewhere. They'll have it in the, some side room, maybe under lock and key. Again, this is a topic that's much broader than I can address right now, but I think it's fairly clear that in many, many parts of the religious world, over centuries, there was a strong, what you might call, anti-philosophical bias, not to try to intellectually delve into the questions of, does God exist, does God not exist, because there was a real fear that it might undermine emunah. And there may be some truth to that. Another example is the Sefer Chovos HaLevavos, Duties of the Heart. Duties of the Heart is one of the greatest ethical books of Musar ever written. It's an old book. It was written in Arabic. It predated the Rambam, and in fact the Rambam testified that it was his own father's favorite sefer, Chovos HaLevavos. Now, Chovos HaLevavos talks about faith and loving God and submitting to God and humility and tshuva, all the important things, Chovos HaLevavos. But the first chapter of Chovos HaLevavos is called Shar HaYichud, the Gate of Unity. And it's a lengthy philosophical treatise proving the existence of God and the incorporality of God, meaning the non-physicality of God, through logical proof and argument. And a common comment about the Chovos HaLevavos is, let's say the Vilna Gaon said, all of the Chovos HaLevavos is holy, but start with chapter 2. Don't read chapter 1. Right? And to this day, there are books commentaries on the Chovos HaLevavos that start with chapter 2 and don't do Shar HaYichud. So, I'm not here to really address this. I'm just throwing out the idea that the issue of philosophy versus faith has been a major issue throughout Jewish history. And it's interesting that the Rambam, as you would expect, was very pro philosophy, ad kedei kach, that he read that type of philosophical investigation into the very meaning of the mitzvah of emunah. The opposite of what you might think. If emunah is translated as faith, you might think it's the opposite of that type of inquiry, and yet the Rambam says that is the idea of making it an intellectual reality. But as I say, how you're going to apply that to yourself and to the education of your own children is a question that everybody does have to grapple with. I will say, if you take a yeshiva like Or Sameach, which deals with largely, not totally, with kids who have come from non-religious secular backgrounds, we are by definition much more open to philosophy because the kids have already been exposed to Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, the famous triumvirate of Apikorsim, some of whom are not alive, and their teachings are they do kiruv for their thing, meaning they do outreach, heretical outreach to, used to be, the old-fashioned Apikoros. Let's take Elisha ben Avoya. You got to give him credit. Elisha ben Avoya is described by Chazal as a great rabbi who became a heretic. And yet we find, the Gemara gives a story that he's riding a horse on Yom Kippur that falls out on Shabbos, eating a treif sandwich, like he's doing a million averos, a treif sandwich, Yom Kippur, riding a horse, which is Asher Drabanan, etc. And Rabbi Meir is following him, asking him questions. And Elisha ben Avoya is answering the questions. And at some point, Elisha ben Avoya says, you can't go any further because I measured the steps, and this is going to be 2,000 amos from your boundary on Shabbos and Yom Kippur, so you got to go back. To me, this has been very striking to me. Elisha ben Avoya is a heretic. You'd figure he would try to make, disciples. And yet, he didn't want to cause Rabbi Meir to violate the Torah. He says, okay, I got my problems, but you don't have to take on my issues. That's very remarkable. I think Elisha ben Avoya deserves a lot of credit for that particular thing. The Apikorsim of today are not that way. The Apikorsim of today want to make converts. They do outreach. So as a result, in the yeshiva like Or Sameach, since our student body has already been exposed to all of the philosophical arguments against God, so we have to get more involved in the philosophical arguments that support God. But if you're in a more sheltered environment, there are those who make the argument, don't get involved. Now again, the counter-argument is, but what's going to happen if 20 years later they get exposed? Okay, these are good questions. I'm not going to address all of these questions, but all I want to say is just the simple historical observation that what the Rambam considered to be mandatory, others consider to be prohibited. In fact, there's a very stinging comment of the Vilna Gaon about Shadim. There's a whole discussion. The Talmud has discussions about demons. And the Rambam writes, no such thing as demons. Demons are metaphors. Demons are symbols of different things. No such thing as demons. So the Vilna Gaon writes the following. The Vilna Gaon writes, he says, if Chazal say, very stern, if Chazal say there are demons, of course there are demons. And if the Rambam says not, he was led astray by his preoccupation with philosophia ha'arura, the accursed rational Greek philosophy that led him to dismiss anything that cannot be explained by pure rationality. So the Vilna Gaon had his thing against that. Someone asked the Kotzker Rebbe in the 19th century, he says, who's right, the Vilna Gaon or the Rambam? So the Kotzker Rebbe said, well, of course the Vilna Gaon is right. If Chazal say there are demons, there are demons. So how come we don't see them today? He says, once the Rambam says they don't exist, so even the demons have to respect his view. So they get out of the way. That's what the Kotzker Rebbe said. So they're kind of both right. Okay, but the main thought I wanted to share with you is based. It's not totally in the Or HaChaim, but it's based on a comment of Rav Chaim ben Attar, the great Or HaChaim HaKadosh, one of the great rabbis who came to Yerushalayim in the 1700s. He's buried on the Har HaZeisim. Here, his yahrzeit I think is the 15th of Tammuz, and actually to this day, thousands and thousands of people go to the kever of the Or HaChaim on the Mount of Olives in Har HaZeisim. And the Or HaChaim says the following: if you look at the hachanot, the preparations for Matan Torah, so it starts off this way: B'chodesh Hashlishi, it was the third month. Let's say Bnei Yisrael be'eretz Yisrael, from the time that they left Egypt, because it's the month of Sivan. Bayom Hazeh, on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, Bo Midbar Sinai, they came to the Sinai desert. So it already tells me they came to Sinai. Then it seems to go backwards and repeats. It says, Vayisu Mirafidim. They traveled from the oasis of Refidim. That's where we encountered Amalek. Vayavo Midbar Sinai. And they came to the Midbar Sinai. But it just said they came to Sinai. And then it repeats, Vayachanu Bar Midbar, and they encamped by the desert. Vayichan Sham Yisrael neged Ahor, and it says, and they encamped adjacent to the mountain. So there's a lot of problems here. Number one, the whole second pasuk is redundant. I know from the end of Parshat B'Shalach last week, when we encountered Amalek, we were in an oasis that was called Refidim. And the first pasuk of the parak tells me we got to Sinai. So putting one and one together, I know we left Refidim and we came to Sinai. So why does the second pasuk have to say we left Refidim and we came to Sinai? It's redundant. Second of all, within the pasuk itself, it repeats. Because after it says we came to Midbar Sinai, it says, Vayachanu, they camped at Midbar Sinai. Well, if they came, they camped. And then it repeats again, they encamped by the mountain, but you'll notice it doesn't say it in plural, Vayachanu, Vayichan, singular. So the whole second pasuk is redundant, and within that second pasuk, there are redundancies and repetitions. So the Or HaChaim gives a very, very beautiful answer. And that is the following. The first pasuk is describing the trip in terms of its geography. They came to Sinai, and I know from the end of B'Shalach, they left Refidim, they came to Sinai. The second pasuk is not describing the physical journey, but it's describing the spiritual journey that they had to go through to prepare for Matan Torah. A 4-step spiritual journey. And since the Ramban says we have to relive the experience of Sinai every day, the same 4-step spiritual journey that they had to go through then is a 4-step spiritual journey we have to go through now. So let's break down Pasuk Beis, this Perek Chaf Pasuk Beis, into the 4 steps. Step 1, you must leave Refidim. Now what is Refidim? Refidim is a place, indeed, and that is the place where Amalek attacked us. But Chazal also say that the name Refidim has a symbolic meaning. It's a contraction of Rafu Yedehem. Their hands were weak. Now this is an idiomatic expression in Hebrew for a lack of passion, a lack of intensity, a lack of commitment. The expression would be that when you're holding something that's very dear to you, you're holding your baby, for example, and you're crossing King George, you're going to hold the baby tight. If you have, something that's unimportant to you, you have a tissue, all right, so hopefully you're not going to intentionally throw it in the street, although a lot of people do that, but you're holding it loose. If it blows away, you don't really care that much. So rifyan yadayim, weakening of the hands, is an idiomatic Hebrew term for not caring about something, being complacent, not being invested. So Chazal make the point that the reason we were vulnerable to Amalek is because even though we were keeping whatever mitzvos we had at that time, that's before Matan Torah. Remember, in the oasis of Mara, we got a number of mitzvos, but we were doing it without enthusiasm. We were doing it without intensity. And when there is coldness of the heart, Amalek enters. Because remember the fundamental idea. Amalek on the outside has no power over Kedusha unless there's an Amalek on the inside. It's the Amalek on the inside that makes us vulnerable to the external Amalek on the outside. And what is the Amalek on the inside? It's not necessarily vicious evil. It's coldness of the heart, indifference, complacency. So the first step towards truly accepting God's Torah is to journey away from Refidim. Refidim is the state of complacency, indifference, lack of passion, lack of geschmack. This is a real problem. A person could be very frum, a person could be very, very observant, but there's no excitement, there's no passion, there's no sense of enthusiasm in their avodas Hashem. This is coldness. This is boredom. This is indifference. Somebody once described the situation of sometimes Orthodox Jews, that instead of 613 mitzvot, they look at life as 613 problems that you got to figure out ways around in order to do what you really want to do in life. Meaning they don't look at mitzvos as life. They look at mitzvos as barriers that are preventing them from living lives. And yeah, they're committed to navigating those barriers, but it's all about navigation, as opposed to the idea that this is life. So step number one is embrace enthusiasm. Mitzvos with simcha. Now, obviously, much easier said than done. Well, how do I do that? What do I do? One has to think about it. One has to work. One has to think about, how do I bring hischadshut? How do I bring renewal? How do I bring passion? How do I bring excitement? It may be especially hard because there's a lot of things that are repetitive. I mean, we daven 3 times a day. Especially when you have a constant repetition, there is always the risk of routinization. And we have to constantly think about how to be mechadesh, how to innovate, excitement in our avodas Hashem. This is a major, major challenge. People are always asking, how do I get my kids to be excited about Yiddishkite? Well, that's a very good question. But part of the answer is, if we would be excited about Yiddishkite, our kids would be excited too. So it's not always a question of, how do I motivate them? It's actually a question of, how do I motivate me? And when I'm motivated, that's going to be contagious in many, many ways. So that's the first step. Leave the world of Rafidim. Embrace the world of passion. Now, the next step is coming to the desert. Vayavo'u midbar Sinai. So here, the notion of desert, many people actually find, many photographers actually find the desert a beautiful environment. Not necessarily that you want to live there, but they find the desert beautiful precisely because it's so empty. The world as we live in is a very cluttered world. Buildings, stuff, hordes of people, whatever it would be. And the desert has a certain beauty precisely because it's empty, it's devoid of a lot of materialism. And therefore, the second lesson to be Makabel Hashem's Torah is to try to divest ourselves of an over-involvement in stuff, in things. Now, this is a little bit complicated because Judaism certainly does not advocate poverty. It does not say deliberately to live a life of asceticism and renunciation. One should try to have a relatively comfortable life because Chazal understands that this is marchiv dato shel adam. It gives a person a certain expansiveness in which they could do mitzvos and learn Torah in a good way. But we also have to be very, very careful about kind of ruling over our possessions and not having our possessions rule over us. I remember years ago, Pepsi ran a campaign that if you drink a certain amount of Pepsi, you can redeem the thing for prizes. In fact, I remember as a law school teacher, there was actually a case. They had a commercial which was totally intended to be a joke, where if somebody got 6 million Pepsi points, they could get a carrier jet. Of course, they made a cheshbon that this would be impossible. No human being could possibly accumulate 6 million Pepsi points. But some kid managed to do it. Maybe he was working with Iran. And he accumulated 6 million points. He demanded a carrier jet, which actually would be illegal. I mean, you can't just, even if you have the money, you can't just buy a jet for your backyard. And he took Pepsi to court. And Pepsi's argument was, hey kid, it's a joke. Okay, the mice of Pepsi won the case. It was a joke. But nevertheless, the motto of this campaign was, drink Pepsi, get stuff. Get stuff. Doesn't make a difference what stuff it is. I just want to get stuff. It's almost like just getting stuff is the end of things, no matter what the stuff is. And we recognize that the more we're filled with materialism and the like, the less sensitive we are to spirituality and to ruchnius. That's something. And there actually is even a psychological reason for that. You know, one of the concerns with internet, and it's interesting now that even secular colleges are now wanting to cut down on the use of internet and the like, because they say that with internet, forget about pornography and the bad stuff, but just web surfing, the phenomenon of web surfing, means you just go from thing to thing to thing to thing. There's no concentration, there's no analysis. You can't sit still for anything that's complicated. That's why they say it used to be a standard college class was always 50 minutes, 5-0. And now when they do online courses, a lot of them are 20 minutes because they've actually found that nobody could concentrate for more than 20 minutes at a time. And the answer is because we get habituated to instant gratification. And when you get habituated to instant gratification, you don't take the time or effort to master things that are slow. So whether it's junk food versus French cooking, take that example, whether it's comic book versus Shakespeare, this phenomenon that once we get habituated to the instant, we don't take the time and the effort for things that are actually much more valuable. That's the way it works. So materialism and ruchnius is exactly the same thing. Material pleasure tends to give you instant gratification. Spiritual pleasure, which is so profound and real, but it takes work. You know, you open up a Gemara, you're not going to get automatically an instant nirvana. You work about it, you think about it. So as a result, the Orach Chaim says, if stage one of the journey is to leave Rafidim and embrace enthusiasm and passion, stage two is try to keep your life simple. Don't be overly involved in the material pursuits of life, because that can drag you down very, very, very easily. Now, I remember hearing a story from Pesach Krohn. He or somebody once had a guest for Shabbos who was a Choser B'Tshuvah who had been a competitive cyclist. He had been a bicycle rider in races. And he had to leave it because most of these long bicycle races are on Shabbos. So he stopped doing it. It was a big sacrifice. So the question becomes, he always gets asked, how was it like to give up, something that you had a passion about? So the gentleman said, actually, I find there's a lot of similarities between keeping the Torah and doing marathon bicycle racing. What's the comparison? He says, when you're a marathon cyclist and you're competing, like really any Olympic sport is like that, you're competing against people who are very talented. The differences between the gold and the silver, and even the gold and the copper, and even the gold and the people who are not even copper, could be very, very small. They could be, like I say, swimming. These could be a difference between the first place and the 10th place. Might be 2 seconds. Right? Nothing that's really normally significant except in that championship context. So when you're a bicycle, you're riding your bike, and you got all these people in back of you that are breathing down your neck. You got to learn to get rid of everything you don't need. Get rid of the scarf, get rid of the cap, because every little thing might be holding you back. So what I learned from cycling is get rid of the baggage you don't need. And that's what I learned from Torah. Get rid of the baggage I don't need. Whether it's material junk, whether it's resentments, whatever your baggage can come in many, many different forms. My angers, whatever it would be. So that's the idea of midbar, emptiness. Create a space for God by kind of getting rid of the stuff that distracts you from God. So that's step two, right? Vayisu mirafidim, vayavau midbar Sinai. Step three, though, repeats the word midbar. Vayachanu bamidbar. So midbar has a second appearance in the verse. What is the meaning of the second appearance? So here the Orach Chaim says, Midbar has another connotation. Besides simplicity and emptiness, it also connotes humility. Because the Midbar is the dirt or the sand that people walk on. In Elokai Nitzor, every day in the Shemona Esrei. We say, Nafshi ka'afor, may I be like the dust that people trod on, that I don't care about my ego. So that's the third step in accepting Torah, to cultivate the notion of humility. Humility is very, very necessary to be open to God's Torah. Because first of all, without humility, you're not willing to learn from other people. Because you always think you know the best and the like. And when we're filled with our own egotism, God's word doesn't always permeate. You see? So, step one, enthusiasm. Step two is simplicity. Step three is humility. And then we finally come to step four. Vayichan Sham Yisrael. The Jewish people encamped next to the mountain. And here already Chazal point out that Vayichan at the end of the Pasuk is B'lashon Yachid. It is written in the singular. Earlier in the same Pasuk, Vayachanu was Lashon Rabim, plural. Vayichan is Lashon Yachid. And here Chazal say we had to be Ke'ish Echad Uvalev Echad. We could not accept the Torah till we were like one person, one soul, unity, togetherness, Avat Yisrael. Kabbalah Satorah cannot occur when there's machlokas, dissension. Do you remember in the Dayenus that we recite at the Seder? So it says, oh, if God would have done this and not done the other things, Dayenu, that would have been enough to be grateful. So some of the Dayenus are problematical. So it says, for example, if you would have brought us to Mount Sinai and you wouldn't have given us the Torah. Dayenu. Well, one could ask the question, why is that Dayenu? What would the point have been to be brought to Har Sinai and not get the Torah? What's Dayenu? That's nothing. So many Mefarshim say, well, yes, but it means if we would have reached the level of Ish Echad Uvalev Echad, even if it wouldn't have been followed by the Torah, that itself would have been something to be grateful for. Kal v'chomer, of course, that we got the Torah. So we have a very neat package, according to the Orach Chaim, of a 4-step plan. Passion, simplicity, humility, unity. These are the 4 steps Klal Yisrael had to take in order to be makabel the Torah. And since every day we have to re-accept God's Torah, these are 4 steps that we need to work on as well. So now let me just add something to the Orach Chaim based on a very, very well-known story in Maseches Bava Metzia. I'm sure you've heard the story before. This is the story that involves what's called Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai. Achnai means a serpent. The oven that was shaped as a serpent. And this involved a portable earthenware oven that was cut into horizontal strips, like hula hoops, if you remember. Older people may remember the hula hoop. And it would be carried by just carrying the hoops and then reassembling it with mortar or some type of cementing in between that they would then discard when they wanted to transport it again. So there was a machlokas, Tanoim, if such an oven is susceptible to ritual impurity. It's a machlokas. So most of the sages said it is tameh. Rabbi Eliezer said it was pure. And the Gemara goes on, again, the particulars of that debate are not relevant to us, but the Gemara mentions that Rabbi Eliezer brought all sorts of proofs for his position, and the sages disagreed with him, and they ruled the halacha was the way they felt. Yeah. The Gemara then goes on and says, Rabbi Eliezer could not convince them by argumentation, So he wanted to convince them by supernatural miracle that God agreed with his position. And the Gemara recounts he actually did 3 miracles. The first miracle was, if the halacha is like me, let the carob tree uproot itself and fly away. And the carob tree moved like a rocket. And the Chachamim said, we don't listen to trees. Okay. If the halacha is like me, let the river reverse its course. And the river reversed its course. And once again they said, we don't really listen to rivers either. If the halacha is like me, let the walls of the Beis HaMedrash cave in. And the walls were caving in. And Rabbi Yeshua ordered the walls, don't you dare. And the walls didn't know what to do, cave in or straighten up. So the Gemara says, that's why they remain slanting, ad hayom hazeh, meaning like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and it's explaining, oh, these walls are slanting, because the walls didn't know what to do, because they had contradictory commands from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. But, as you could guess, the Chachamim said, we don't listen to walls. We don't care about trees. We don't care about rivers. We don't care about walls. So finally he pulls out the big guns, and he says, if the halacha is like me, let there be a heavenly voice that says I'm right. Let Hashem say who's right here. And a voice from heaven said, halacha k'Rabbi Eliezer. And the Chachamim said, which is of course what they meant all along, he says, we don't even care about that. You said in your Torah, Lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. You entrusted halachic determination to us. We are the ones that you designated as your decisors. Stay out of it. Lo b'shamayim. The Gemara recounts this was such an unusual thing that somebody asked Eliyahu Hanavi, what was God's response when they tell God, but out of this? And it says, Kaviyachal, Hashem was laughing. And Hashem said, Nitzchuni banai, my children have been victorious over me. I will stay out of this fight. This is a huge, fascinating topic, which again, I apologize for bringing up so many things I'm not going to talk about. I will talk about this some other time. I am on a very small part of the story, not the main part of the story, but there's a fascinating connection. It's a thought from the Vilna Gaon as to why Rabbi Eliezer chose those 3 miracles. The miracle of the tree, the miracle of the water, and the miracle of the walls of the Beit HaMedrash. Rabbi Eliezer's initial strategy, which of course is what a Talmud Chacham does, is he was trying to convince them that he was logically correct. Right? That's the first thing you try to do, and he was not successful. They did not accept his arguments. So the Vilna Gaon says, the next thing he wants to do is he wants to say, you ought to listen to me, because I have the midot, I have the character traits that make my halachic decisions more in attune with the will of God. And the Vilna Gaon identifies 3 traits that a Talmud Chacham must have. The first trait, in his order, is he is not overly involved in Gashmias, in the material world. He's not looking for money, he's not looking for possessions. That's symbolized by the carob tree. The tree is testifying, because we know the carob is a very simple food. And when the Gemara wants to describe the greatness of a rabbi who does not live for materialism, it mentions the great Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who only lived on a measure of carobs from Erev Shabbos to Erev Shabbos. So the tree is testifying to his simplicity, his divestment from material pleasure. The second quality is humility, and that's water. Water is a symbol of humility. As Chazal say, Torah is compared to water because it goes from the high ground to the low ground. Now this is interesting. So he's calling on God to make a miracle, but listen to this, to affirm that he is a humble person. Now that may sound a little bit of a contradiction here. I am so humble that this water will change its course to say how humble I am. At first glance, you would say, well, gee, that's kind of boasting about how humble you are. But the truth of the matter is, if he felt he had to make a halachic point, it is legitimate for a person to say, this is not about my ego. This is not about my kavod. This is not about me. This is about emes. And I will show you that God himself, through this miracle, will validate my humility. It's not as much of a contradiction as you would see if a person truly has the right intention. Now, 99% of the time, there will be that self-aggrandizement and ego that's involved. But in some cases, the most modest person, you see it with Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Listen, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah says, was the most humble of all people. And yet, how many times did he assert his leadership? It had to be done. So, the carob tree represents divestment from materialism. The water represents humility. And the final thing about the walls of the Beit HaMedrash represents hasmada, diligence, meaning as if to say, he was the first to come and the last to go. The Beit HaMedrash can testify that I put in the time and the effort to learn. So these are the three character traits he's trying to demonstrate, says the Vilna Gaon. So what I would like to suggest is that these three character traits, although in different order, do match up with 3 out of the 4 of the Orach Chaim. Right? The simplicity of the desert actually matches up with the carob tree. The humility of the desert, albeit desert, matches up with the humility of the water. The passion and excitement matches up with the diligence and the hasmada, because when you're passionate, you stay with it. So Rabbi Eliezer had 3 out of the 4. But he was lacking 1 of the 4. He was lacking unity in his unwillingness to accede to the Chachamim. He was creating machloket. So it's interesting that 3 out of the 4 match up perfectly. And it was the chisaron in Achnai that perhaps was he was a great man, but perhaps was his downfall. In fact, the Gemara itself ends with a very tragic story. He was the Gadol Hador, and he was excommunicated because he refused to accept the decision of the Sanhedrin. And Rabbi Akiva, his disciple, was sent to give him the news. Rabbi Eliezer was sick in bed. Rabbi Akiva came into the chamber, and Rabbi Akiva stood 4 amos away, because when somebody is excommunicated, you're not supposed to be within their 4 amos.
And someone's what?
Excommunicated. So Rabbi Eliezer said, "What's wrong? What's wrong? Why are you standing?" And Rabbi Akiva had to give him the news. It appears that your colleagues have distanced themselves from you. That's how he gave Rabbi Eliezer the news. And Rabbi Eliezer broke down crying. He said, "I have become like a Sefer Torah that's totally wrapped up, that no one reads, no one will look at." And it really was very, very tragic. Rabbi Eliezer died shortly thereafter in a state of excommunication, in spite of the greatness that everyone recognized how great he was. That's why the Gemara has an expression, Rabbi Eliezer Shamuti. Now there are 2 translations of Shamuti. Some say he was a follower of Beis Shammai, although that's a little difficult. And others say Shamuti comes from the word Shamta, which is the Aramaic term for excommunication. Rabbi Eliezer the Shamuti, the one who was excommunicated. But be it as it may, I think correlating the story with the Orach Chaim's 4 elements, I think is instructive. Now, as I say, that's a small part of the story. Obviously, the big part of Torah Shel Achnai is the meaning of Lo B'Shamayim He, and we'll talk about that some other time. Suffice it to say that it certainly illustrates the adage, no man is above the law, because even God is not above the law. Meaning to say, essentially, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a system where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is bound by the rules of the Torah. So how could any human being ever say, it doesn't apply to me? God is bound by his halachic process, even if the halachic process makes a mistake vis-a-vis the divine wisdom. So anyway, wish you very well. Again, a Tu B'Shvat Sameach, a happy Tu B'Shvat. We'll talk about this obviously tomorrow, but generally speaking, the message is that a human being is compared to a tree as well. So when we talk about the Rosh Hashanah for trees, there are going to be aspects of a Rosh Hashanah that applies to all of us. The obvious question is, but how do you then differentiate that from Rosh Hashanah of Tishrei, which is our Rosh Hashanah? Well, if you're going to be able to come to the Seder tomorrow, you'll hear about this. If not, you can see it on YouTube, hopefully. And anyway, but wherever you're going to be, you should have a meaningful, inspirational Chamisha Asar B'Shvat. Thank you.
Neshamot shir shir chadash,